Hello, everyone. What follows is a conversation between myself and my friend Jordyn, where we discussed different life cycles that are the most prominent. I think we explored maybe five or six, maybe more, different astrological life cycles that are pretty much relevant to every single soul, depending on age. Like, for example, everyone goes through a Saturn opposition roughly at age 14 or so. Everyone gets a Saturn return at 29. Everyone gets a progressed lunar return at 27 and so forth. So we talked about these main cycles and what they correspond to, and we also shared which ones we think are the most pronounced and profound throughout our life journey. It was a very interesting and insightful conversation. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Check out the description for Jordyn's channel, Jordyn's website, and also more links for my offerings, my training program, sessions with me, and my newsletter.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jordyn Smith, and as per usual, I am the voice and the astrologer for this YouTube channel, Nonconformist Conscience. And today I have my friend Ari on here, who I have known since I started my astrology journey, pretty much. So, welcome, Ari. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jordyn.
And, with these conversations, I usually let the guests just kind of get after it and talk about what they feel called to talk about that they feel like maybe isn't as understood in astrology or that people have a hard time grasping. And then I'll just kind of chime in or have a conversation with you about this. So why don't you tell us what you want to talk about, and then me and you can go from there.
Okay, so I thought a really fun topic would be the peak ages of a person's life, where there are sort of fixed transits and secondary progressions that happen for everyone at certain ages, right? And it's kind of like if you just like go through the chronological ages of a human life from, we'll look at it today from zero till the mid 80s. There are just certain periods that really spike, like really give 2 or 3 years where there's going to be a whole lot of strong planetary and transit and progression activity that's really worth noting. So we'll talk about these peak ages according to transits and secondary progressions according to something that we all universally experience.
I love it. I feel like this is it. It is one of those things that people do talk about. There's the high ones like the Saturn return or nodal return, but there's some other key ones that I think are important for people to understand, because then they can go and look at, you know, reflect on the past of, oh, well, that is what was going on back then. And this is why this was happening. And this was what this was signifying and meaning for me. So I'm excited to jump into this. And so if you want to share anything, um, you know, uh, slides, you go for it. And I'm going to let you start this off, and I'll jump in.
Well, to what you just said, I think also I notice this all the time. I'm sure you have as well. People will associate certain experiences in their life with the really well-known transits, but not realize that there's like two other really big things happening that are
Yes.
just less popular, right? Like Saturn return's the best example, where we
Yes.
have Saturn return, but there's like secondary progressive lunar return and your transiting nodal opposition happening all within a 2 3 year period.
Mhm.
So all of these ages that we'll talk about have usually 2 or 3 really big astrological events happening at pretty close proximity to one another.
Yeah.
I'll share one more thing too.
Yeah.
Um, some planets have a really big eccentricity, which means they'll spend more times, more years in some signs than others. So, for example, Chiron and Pluto have a pretty big eccentricity. So, because of that, I'm not going to include them too much because they're not reliable trackers. For example, um, people born with Pluto in Scorpio or Libra more or less will get their Pluto square somewhere close to age 40.
Hmm.
People born with Pluto in Capricorn will get their Pluto square around 60. Likewise, your your third last quarter Chiron return, Chiron square can be in your 20s or 2 decades later. So we're going to focus mostly on the planets where their eccentricity is pretty low and so that these transits are more or less universal for all ages.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point to mention. And just like for people in layman's terms, I think what you're trying to say is also it's a generational dynamic.
Right.
When we're looking at Pluto or Chiron and certain signs, they stay for shorter periods, like you mentioned, Pluto and Scorpio. It actually stays in that sign the least amount of time out of all of the signs,
Oh,
whereas,
really?
you know, um, Pluto and Capricorn is going
Wait,
to get
Pluto
this.
spends the least amount of time in Scorpio?
Yeah,
That's ironic.
isn't it?
Yeah, it
I,
is.
yeah,
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
makes sense though, you know? It's wanting to get something done in its home sign.
Get in, get out. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, well, yeah, go ahead. I'm excited for this.
Okay. So I'll share some slides. These are also slides that I've created. I use this when I teach transits and progressions in my training program. So I'm going to utilize these. What I've done is I've mapped these according to sort of like 7-year segments, like the Saturn cycles. So here are all like the main life transits that happen within the first Saturn square, meaning the first 7-ish years, while Saturn's moving from 0 degrees separation to about 90 degrees separation. And these are good chunks, like these are good segments from which we can kind of divide and categorize periods of our life. So obviously there are many things, but what I would focus on as the most pivotal would be around ages 5 or 6 till age 8.
Yeah.
And again, these ranges are a little wide because they can happen at slightly different ages. We have the secondary progressed first quarter square. And for those that aren't familiar, secondary progressed is sort of like a subchart. It's calculated wherein 1 year of your life in progressions is reflected or identical to 1 day of your life. So on the 7th year of your life, your secondary progress chart looks like what the transits look like on day 7 after your birth.
Yes.
So following secondary progressions are these subcycles and themes that are developing our own evolutionary personal cycles that we can track throughout an entire lifetime. So that first time we're the moon, our sense of identity, our sense of security, how we emotionally integrate and assimilate experience, moon is so essential. It's squaring itself during that time. And at that same time, also Saturn has moved 90 degrees. So that window of roughly 6 to 8 years old is a powerful time of individuation. That square is this initial push of self. Who am I? The self-reflection. Who am I in the world? How do I adopt to this? I mean, there's so much happening on a biological and psychological level. I'm beginning to individuate and discover myself in a more broader social term. Our sense of identity becomes less and less linked with the familiarity of my home and that which is nurturing and caring. And I'm more interested in becoming a social being. There's a whole lot of maturation that occurs there. So that's to me, I think Jeffrey Wolf Green once taught something more or less to the likes of at that time the primary identification shifts from the child to the from the mother to the father. And I think just to
Yes.
say there's more of a sense of I'm no longer needing to be held in that familiar womb space. I'm more of an individual now.
Yeah, I find it interesting. I was reading about a lot of this. I always go back to like the old message board. It's a wealth of information. I feel like anyone who's studying EA should get on there. But I remember, Rad was talking about how this is the time where we pretty much what you're saying. We start to understand that we're separate from mom, and then our conditioning is getting kicked in by the authority figures in our life. And so we're having to figure out, who am I outside of this, and how do I fit into this with that whole Saturn dynamic? And I find it interesting. I talk about my kids often on here. My oldest kiddo's first Saturn square, they have Saturn retrograde in the 10th house. And that is actually a time whenever I was a single parent and their dad was absolutely taken out of their life. And
Mhm.
their only other father figure had just passed away. So first Saturn square, and also there's this dynamic of, oh, time, space, reality. It's like
Mm.
the first introduction of I have a limited amount of time to do X, Y, and Z, and there are external influences that are reflecting this back to me at this time to make it really clear that there are some Saturnian lessons that are starting to kick in at this point in time. And of course, not everyone's gonna, have the situation that my child did, but it's a good one to use for just how that can be so sometimes people's charts become very literal, and that's a good
Absolutely.
one.
Mhm. It really it kicks into motion a lot of the core soul dynamics. It makes it more real. I was just thinking, what can I remember from my life? And I have two memories. So somewhere between 6 and 7, I have a memory of being in kindergarten, and more or less I recall needing to go to the bathroom.
Mhm.
And I mean, there's so much individuation. I'm in a new school, it's a 30-minute drive from my home, and with all these new people, and I didn't quite know what the protocol was, right? Like, I have to go to the bathroom, but how do I let the teacher know? And when do I let the teacher know? There's like
Yeah.
this sense of like feeling confused around how to navigate. I have a need. How do I express that need in an unfamiliar? And it just felt like a very hard, I think it's really cool to remember the psychology of what it's like to have an accident when you're 6 years old, because
Yes.
all kids do it. But I
Yeah.
could actually remember the confusion that I experienced. Like I know I needed to go, but I didn't know how to ask. And then
Yeah.
another memory is we're on the blackboard, and I'm a righty and there's this other girl who's a lefty, and my arm brushed her arm. And it's like a religious school. And I
Hmm.
just remember being socially aware of my arm touch her arm, and that I sensed and felt her awareness of it and other kids and what they would think of it. It's like all of this social awareness suddenly that I've never experienced before.
Yeah. You're having to figure out the social boundaries too. It's such a boundary thing when you get down to brass tacks about it. I think,
Mhm.
you know, some of my Saturn square, I think this is a theme in my family. My Saturn square, what I remember is this was whenever my dad had his first heart attack. So it got me really introduced to, you know, like, oh, well, how would I even exist in the world? Like if it made me very aware of someone can go and not be there, or luckily he was able to stay. But like, I remember having all of these thoughts of like, well, what happens? Like, how would I be able to, who is mom going to take care of me? What's going to go on here? Just all of these questions that start a cycle of, I think, deep self-reflection at that age, like to the capacity that a child can. So that's what it was
Fantastic.
inducing for me as I remember just being in my room and like self-reflecting and like really trying to be like, well, how would I do this? Now I have a lot of Capricorn, so I was more of like, you know, trying to figure it out and control it, right? Good old Capricorn. But I find it interesting because it's like when you're learning these social boundaries and how the world exists and your place in it, and um, you're also realizing that you're separate from things, and then also there are some things when we're thinking of Saturn, we can think of control, but there's also sometimes there are things that we can't control, and it's teaching us about that as well. And that is,
Right.
it can be a Saturnian lesson.
For those of us who are parents, it's helpful to appreciate. I think there's more natural self-reflection and self-awareness and social awareness in our children that's emerging at those ages, because it just there's so much being internalized. All right, shall we
Yes,
move on to the next?
absolutely.
Okay, so the next one, kind of following with those same planetary energies, is basically from ages on the low end 12, on the high end 16. Most people, not necessarily that far of a gap. I mean, 12 is really the starting point of that. That's your Jupiter return. And then we have secondary moon opposition, so where that progressed moon is opposite your natal moon. And then Saturn opposition, where Saturn's opposite your natal Saturn. Um, to me, this is probably in the top three of the most significant and permeating period of change in our life, right? So at the low end of it, you can have your secondary progressed opposition coinciding with your Jupiter return, right? So these things could happen if your secondary progressed moon is happening on the earlier side. This Jupiter return is this immense expansion of philosophical, social, larger cosmological awareness. It's like in many traditions, you're going to be sort of on the precipice of initiation into adulthood. You're learning about the world that you live in. You're beginning to think for yourself. You're beginning to understand your place in the cosmos. And I think in context with the two oppositions that are coming,
Mhm.
it brings up the question, who am I? How do I want to live? What are my ethics? What are my values? There's so much. And I think in the span of an entire lifetime, that puberty window is the only window in an entire lifetime where that amount of physical biological change happens on every level, on the brain level, on the hormonal level. We never go through a period of greater physical change in our entire life other than when we're born and when we die, besides for puberty. So it's so
Absolutely.
and it's so fundamental. Everything changes, and that's so explicit to the nature of an opposition. So
Hmm.
again, and it's funny how it's interesting how Saturn and the progressed moon kind of they separate the older you get, but because their cycles are relatively close, like a secondary progressive lunar cycle is a little over 27 years, and a complete Saturn cycle is about 29 years. So they're always going to be really close to each other. For the first 60 or so years of your life, they're going to move into new phases at roughly the same time.
Hmm.
So, and it's interesting because the Saturn moon archetype or a polarity, it has so much to do with who am I, what do I need, how do I care for myself, and who am I in society? So, you know, for me, right? And I have a second house Saturn, right? Scorpio. So I have very vivid memories and more stories than I would want to tell of that time period of reconciling with, okay, what is the proper way to behave? Right? What does my culture, my religion, my society talk about proper conduct and sexuality, and how do I deal with right behavior? So we can become very repressive, we can become very depressed, we can become very rebellious too. That opposition can be you know, this stark awareness of where we're needing to conform or fit into, but then feeling really put off or repressed by that. There's just so much happening that we don't really know how to integrate it all. In a society where there is a lack of proper role modeling and support for these initiatory phases, there isn't a strong Saturnian framework in the current day and age in most parts of the world for supporting children in coping with this huge change. Because suddenly you're aware of being a part of society and needing to fit in and having feelings and hormones and desires, but needing to be appropriate and needing to define yourself, but you haven't really learned who you are yet. So I think at that age, there is an immense need for a lot of emotional and structural support and like guidance to actually mature and grow into a healthy version of what it means to be a human. Because without that guidance, I think there can be a lot of confusion and chaos on the inside.
I would agree. Again, I have my oldest kid is they're about to be 16 in
Okay.
April. So it's, I mean, they're right there. Um, and as you were talking about this, it's like one, your body is changing, like you said, in it's growing in all of the ways. I think of the Jupiter expansion, right? There's like this coming in, or what is the word that they say? These are the years that you're coming into yourself, or what is it? Do you know what I'm talking about? That expression? You're coming of age, right?
Coming of
Those are
age, yeah.
that
Yeah.
is those years, which is so Saturnian to me as well, by the way. But then you're like expanding. And I think that oftentimes kiddos with this Jupiter return secondary progressed moon opposition, Saturn opposition to their natal Saturn. It's exactly what you're talking about, but this is also, we know that this is the age where people rebel, which is this kind of opposition thing going on. But it's also, I think it's important for us to note that, and I feel like a lot of people who listen to this are going to understand this. We live in a society that is structured in a way that is not as as natural as it should be for to facilitate this process. And I think that it's worth mentioning just psychologically that first Jupiter return can induce a lot of alienation. If you are wanting to be your authentic self, you're starting to really realize and grasp, like, this is who I am, and you're realizing I'm very different than my environment, that moon, and then the society and how it is structured right now. And so we see a lot of kiddos during this time. I mean, I experienced it. I watched it happen so much. It's like, how do I fit into this world, or should I even really be fitting into it? Like, do you know what I'm saying? And so there can be that depression on a biological level, and then stemming from when you are a bit different than your environment, and that Jupiter is coming in and it's really asking for you to be authentic and to really ground in that. And yet the environment is like, no, that's not the way that we're supposed to be. And so it just is, it can be, um, I think about the kids in my generation, like whenever I was a teenager, Pluto and Scorpio, but we have that um, Saturn conjunct Uranus, Neptune, kind of depending, the phases
Mm.
just differentiate. And this is where my generation started to become the drug addicts,
Right.
around this age. And then it makes me think about, you know, what was being suppressed, what traumatic, because that's a big trauma signature to me, that triple conjunction. And it's like, what trauma did some, not all, I don't want to overgeneralize, experience around their authenticity, and why are they trying to escape it or suppress what is natural within them? And then it makes me sad because I'm like, it goes back to what you were saying. We should really live in a place where society is structured to just be accepting. Like, I think you understand this as a parent. That's like my biggest thing with my kids is acceptance. Like, you can be free to be whoever you want to be, and I'm going to love you always, and I'm not going to demonize you for going outside of like the status quo or this or that. And I think that that's just a natural way of parenting. But how many of us can really say that we had that or we
Right.
see that going on, right?
And that's, I mean, that's the very tension of Saturn and its opposition,
Yeah.
because there's all these rules and expectations from your parents or from society, from culture. And so it's like, well, I am who I am, but I need to be who I'm supposed to be. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because I think it's almost hard to not fall into one of two extremes during this time.
Yeah.
I know what extreme I fell into. One extreme is you become very good. Like, okay, I got to be a good person, right? I got to
Mm-hmm.
fit into the mold. The other extreme is you become very rebellious,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like the authority figure, your parents. You don't want to just follow your parents' orders. You don't want to follow what society tells you to do. So it becomes like this struggle with authority. I was definitely the good kid,
I
right?
was
But it's like
not.
that's, yeah, I figured.
Was not the good kid.
I had
Uh,
a, and if you're the good kid, if you're repressing, right, that has to come up later, and often it's like the other cycles. And I think for the first 30 years, um, my observation is these initial Saturn squares, like the Saturn square, the Saturn opposition, Saturn return, the two Saturn squares are a lot more impactful than the latter Saturn squares that happen throughout the rest of your life, because this is the
Agreed.
first time we're really forming an identity in the world.
Yeah.
It's pivotal, it's formative. So these first four Saturn squares in that cycle, I think, are just really essential um, for the
Well, and
first 30 years of our
those
life.
first quarter squares to me, they kind of have this, whereas like the last quarter square is more of like an Aquarian kind of, you know, I'm either going to resist or I'm going to absolutely just throw everything off. But that first quarter square, especially whenever you're younger, like leading up to this, that is like your first big moment of emotional maturation and having to learn, can I make a correct judgment and a choice?
Hmm.
I think for me, I was rebellious. I mean, I was just angry. I've got like Moon, Mars opposition, 12th house. Didn't even realize I was angry. So angry at the world. But what I will say is that Jupiter return, on the heels of all of this was where I got into a bit of duplicitous behavior. I had a lot of, which is a form of cognitive dissonance, like if we're being,
Mm-hmm.
honest. Like it was like, and it's an overcompensatory behavior, right? Like you want to be authentic, but you, on some level, it's like you're trying to navigate, like, do I be authentic or do I do what everyone says that I'm supposed to do? And so it's like you can have this experience of, at times I was doing what everyone wanted me to do, but on the inside I was like, this is not who I am, And so it's this juxtaposition of teaching you I think it's teaching you honestly a Saturnian dynamic of self-reflection again, in order to, we can't cultivate wisdom without making mistakes, right? And when we make mistakes and we take accountability, all of these Saturn words I'm thinking about, that means that you have to self-reflect and you have to own something. You have to own what's yours and not own what's not yours, right? But that takes some finessing and a learning of, how do I make correct judgment? I've got to mess up a little bit and figure out, this doesn't feel right or this feels right. And then if you are doing that self-reflection work, that is where the wisdom builds over time. And I think that that's also what you're talking about, is it becomes easier and easier because you're practicing it throughout your life. But those initial ones, oh, hard. So hard because it's
So
the
much
first
that
time.
as completely, and just as parents, again, to teach and empower children to have that safety and that spaciousness, to figure it out, to experiment, to actually find out what is it like to be you in the world. Um, it's worth mentioning too that these phases, like these 7-ish year cycles, often become templates to play out karmic dynamics. And it's
Mhm.
like we won't be able to make any other choices than the one that we've made oftentimes. Like for me to become very conservative, it wasn't even about I'm needing to be accepted. It was about I really wanted to be a good person. I wanted to be ethical, right?
Mhm.
And I wanted to live according to my understanding of what God wanted of me.
Mhm.
And I had to experience that and play it out. So the culture, the family, the society that we were born into, we're going to play out the experiences that oftentimes will set us up for the kind of awareness and self-awareness that we will cultivate
Yeah,
as a result of those experiences. And such a big part of our early life experiences are going through the stage of what we've intended to go through so we can kind of like catch the teachings and move on with our life.
absolutely. And I love that you brought that up because it actually, I had an experience with a family member a while back, and they were like, now I don't really agree with this because it's like coming from a more like kind of judgy place that's not necessarily rooted in authenticity. I don't really want to get too much into it, but essentially, I had like a family member, and they were like, well, unfortunately, you'll have to suffer the consequences of your actions. And my actions were, so this is a Saturn thing.
Yeah,
Now, my
very sad.
actions were, at first, I was really pissed off about this, but the reason why this is getting brought up in my mind is this is segueing off of my experience of that Saturn opposition and that Jupiter return. I just wanted to be free. I wanted to be authentic. I wanted to, you know, um, think for myself. And, I didn't believe the things that I was supposed to believe. And, I was very much like, that's no. Um, and I kind of had my own spiritual practice whenever I was younger, not necessarily the words for it, but it was very different than my family. but I've been learning boundaries, and that's essentially what the consequences was about my boundaries that I was having, which was
Mm,
the same thing that I was trying to do whenever I was younger and then kind of rebelled against it. And so now, as time is going on, it's like,
yeah,
well, now
yeah,
we're learning how to respond to this instead of react to it too. Do you
beautiful.
know what
Yeah,
I'm saying? So it's
and we can,
very,
yeah,
and not taken in as judgment of,
yeah,
hey, you might just not understand me, and that's okay. You know what I'm
yeah,
saying?
totally.
So, but I
And
love
so
that you brought that up.
many of the identities that we'll try on during that time in our life are dynamics that we're going to be integrating and working with later on in our
Mm,
life from a matured agency.
yes, I feel
It's really
that
interesting.
so much as you were talking about it. Okay.
Okay, let's go to the next one. So I would also consider this probably to be somewhere in the top 3 or 4 most important pivotal, right? And
Hmm.
it's not that long after the whole puberty. So, you know, there's a period in your life that is just, I guess, from birth, more or less from birth till early 20s. But this puberty window, and there's like some integration time, but you're a teenager, and that's always just what it is. From around 18 until 21 or so. Basically, we have the nodal return
Hmm.
at 18. We have the secondary progress last quarter square, Saturn last quarter square. All of that's around 19, 20, 21, 22. And also between 20 and 22 is the Uranus first quarter square.
Yeah.
So it starts, right? It starts with this nodal return. And the reason why I put the nodal return in there is because to me, that is a fundamental marker in the span of our entire lifetime. Like that nodal return is it's like a statement, it's a seal that says there's your life until now, but as a soul, the reasons for why you're here are now beginning to come through. The nodes being this portal of past dynamics coming through, being released, being resolved, being integrated, and our evolutionary purpose beginning to emerge. Something becomes very clear and evident. So, karmically, that nodal return is the most dense in terms of meeting the underlying soul reasons for being here. So like up until then, it's a lot of integrating in society and the formation of the human identity and participating in the world and a lot of maturation. It's huge and essential.
Yeah.
But that nodal return is like, and here's the underlying soul program for this lifetime. Oftentimes I feel it's only at that nodal return that from a sort of, it's hard to qualify this, but from like a soul perspective, it feels often like our life really begins because that's almost where the journey sort of becomes a little more evident. And then
Hmm.
right after then we have a couple more really powerful, again, more secondary progress Saturn, Moon, Saturn stuff, but it's a last quarter square. So it's, as you mentioned with last quarter, throwing off any kind of dynamics that aren't relevant or useful for the blossoming individuality, but it's more stress.
Yeah.
Who am I going to be? What choices will I make now? How am I going to further actualize and give more concrete definition to my life? But what I love about this is it ends with Uranus square. And again, because of slight eccentricity, that square could happen as early as 20, as late as 22. This Uranus square is really important. It's the first time an outer planet is making a cardinal angular aspect to itself, right? That angular aspect being the 90 degrees, 180 degrees, you know,
Yeah.
aspects. So those angular aspects, the 90-degree square, is really catalyzing. So the Uranian dynamics are really being triggered and catalyzed around that age, which in the context of our ongoing awakening, that can also be a real blossoming of our larger spiritual identity and kind of the first time that we're really grasping a deeper, more non-physical dimension of our own being. And of course, socially, it can really put a lot of stress around where we think we're going, but where we actually are going. So it's just very, very foundational.
Yeah. I mean, man, this was a difficult period in my life, I will say that. Like, um, but I don't think that it necessarily always has to be for people. I like what you said whenever you talked about that first nodal return kind of jump starting this whole thing, because that's speaking to this is what you came here to do. My first nodal return, I'm always an open book on here because I feel like if I can help someone, fine, whatever. Like it's also a way for me to not, it's like releasing my Virgo shame, right? That I've carried that is absolutely not mine to carry. Um, I mean, yeah. Well, anyway, so my nodal return is whenever I met my oldest kiddo's father, and we're dealing with Virgo Pisces stuff. And like I was such a soul who I rebelled, I was figuring out my like authenticity. And then I remember it was actually my Saturn opposition. I went and I lived with my dad for the first time.
Mm.
And uh all of the Virgo perfectionism and Capricornian stuff, I was like, gotta be perfect, gotta, okay, all of this. And then I got into this really crazy relationship that confronted me with um, a lot of the things that I was needing to purge, if that makes sense, the Virgo stuff. And so I feel like that first nodal return is giving you, it's like your first introduction into if there's something that you're having to re-experience from a prior lifetime, this is like your initial chance around this area of you get to make a different choice. And for me, it it took a massive extreme for me to counteract things, but boy, whenever it happened and then my Uranus square happened, I was like, I will never do this again. And I like started to just absolutely like liberate, from very Uranian of like I can't suppress this. I'm not that person. And whenever I abandon, and then I feel guilty, which is natural guilt. Abandoning yourself is absolutely natural guilt. I want to make that very clear. I just didn't ever want to experience that again. And that Uranus square that happened after my first nodal return. So crisis, disillusionment, all of the Virgo Pisces things for my nodal return, right? And then I had the Uranus square. And that is where I literally started liberating myself from these dynamics that I wasn't even aware of, right? It's like I was in la land because of one, maturity, and two, Piscean kind of dynamics going on with this. But it was definitely my first sense of freedom of this is make or break. You
Mm.
either absolutely start throwing this off or you're going to keep experiencing this. And it's like on a soul level, I was like, I don't want to experience this anymore. So I don't know if yours was, I mean, again, I have Virgo Pisces and my chart, but I don't know how your experience was with your first nodal return. I'm pretty sure you went to college, right? And then you had like these experiences of like really having to confront your individuality outside of the status quo of the college that you were in. I
Yeah,
think
well, I
I've
was
heard you
supposed
kind
to
of
go to
talk about
Israel
this.
after high school. 'Cause I was struggling with my religiosity, right, at that
Okay.
point. So I was very religious throughout high school, and then eh, as I was approaching that nodal return, my questions and my doubts were just too strong, right? Um,
Yeah.
and again, my second house, Saturn in Scorpio, so I had a lot of repressed sexual energy, and I
Hmm.
began forming like secretive relationships. So it's like still religious, but
Yeah.
finding these like secretive, it's wrong, it's bad, and no one can know about it, so I'm doing something wrong. So shame, shame, shame.
Internalizing.
Um,
Yeah.
and to express my sexual energy. And so I felt like a dishonest person. My nodal axis is Sagittarius Gemini.
Yep.
So South Node and Sat, I felt like a fundamentally, and I'm teaching, and I was even like in 12th, the nodal return can really start for, people who go to a typical, Westernish school system, 12th grade, right?
Yeah.
Um, I was traveling the country teaching because I was on like this position on this Jewish Orthodox youth movement. And the things that I was teaching about, I was doing programming to integrate kids with special needs. like autism, Down syndrome within the mainstream Orthodox community. So it's like really beautiful
That is
work
beautiful.
that
Yeah.
resonated with my soul, but within the context of an Orthodox environment, right? But I
Yeah.
loved it. I absolutely loved it because it resonated with who I am as a soul. But I'm a role model, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
would go to these Shabbat retreats and teach and do some programming. Um, I received a bunch of really high level awards at the end of the year, that in theory would put me into prestige with rabbinical leaders and, like really just recognize me as a leader within the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was going to go to Israel just after that time to decisively, a very religious yeshiva, like school in Israel, to really ask my questions. Um, and I was very surprised that I was accepted to this one school. It's like really, I didn't even think I was like studied or skilled enough to be accepted into this school.
Well, Saturn
So I felt
in your
really,
second house too, like
I
the
felt really grateful.
self-confidence. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I interrupted you,
But I
but yeah.
didn't go to that school because I actually had mono. And
Okay.
around the time that I was supposed to go, I got really sick. And I got mono because I was making up with a girl that I met and she gave me mono, right? So
Right.
again, all of this shame. So I ended up staying in the States and I went to Yeshiva University, which is it's a Jewish college, but it also has a very strong secular department.
Okay.
And that allowed me to, really immerse myself still in the Jewish environment and ask a lot of questions, but study a lot and read secular books and also just meet more people. Like that Gemini dimension, it was a really good transition
Yeah.
because I received more of that Gemini, the broader world and duality and people with different perspectives and ways of thinking, but it wasn't too shocking. Like
Yeah.
I wasn't psychologically interested in or prepared to leave that religious environment. So I had this experience where I was still doing leadership work, and I was a part of a group of college kids that would travel to different local colleges and do programming with the Jewish students in those colleges. Like we would do prayer with them, and I loved it, right? Like we would sing, we would teach prayers, and just basic education. And
Yeah.
even though I was struggling with my relationship to religion and God from a Jewish perspective and who I'm supposed to be, I still loved doing that because the connection and the prayers and like the Sagittarius qualities of just bringing out my authentic voice always felt really meaningful,
Yeah.
but I still felt like I was lying. So I told one of the rabbinical leaders, I said, listen, I love doing this work, but here's what's happening inside of me. And I was already like praying less. I wasn't waking up for all of the daily morning prayer. I was beginning to become lax in my practices that used to be very solid and devout and consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I told him that I'm questioning God and I'm just not sure if I believe in these things, he said, "Well, I guess you can't be a part of this, right?" And I was sad. I understood, but it was sad because it meant letting go of something that I really loved. And that was just a part of a series of letting go that began happening. The more honest I became, first with myself, and then just like being transparent with everyone else, because I really couldn't live with the incongruency of pretending to be something on the outside, but not really being that on the inside. More and
Absolutely.
more, I realized I didn't have anything to say. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what to believe in. That was really hard. So towards the end of my first semester, I mean, I got really depressed, had a pretty big breakdown, but it just led to a shift where I be opened up to, again, this is why that nodal return for so many souls, just like here's where your life begins. I opened up to this hard awareness that I'm going to have to live my life and it's not going to be what I thought it would be. It's,
Absolutely.
and I have no clue what it will be, but that there's whatever the truth is, I want to find it and I'm going to have to open up to wherever that takes me. So everything changed from there. And it didn't take very long for me to discover astrology.
Mm-hmm.
And at my Saturn square, I was already giving readings. Like I was looking at charts like all the time.
Yeah.
I formed a relationship with Adam Gainsberg, my first astrology teacher. I remember being in Katrina, in 2005 in New Orleans after Katrina, at a volunteer camp that I spent some time like pulling up people's charts and like reading people's charts there. And spending hours sitting with them. So just I became hungry to learn more about reality and explore these parts of my soul that wanted to figure out what the truth was. It all opened up and developed really quickly at that time.
I love that. This is kind of jumping ahead, but I will say, I think for my first, that period of my life, it was like I absolutely had to relive certain key dynamics that were so uncomfortable. Obviously, you too. Like for you, you were having to make a choice to be honest. Like that's the saggy stuff that you had going on. Like you could have easily, you know, not said anything to your was it the rabbi or your who
One of
at
the
the
leaders,
school?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so um for me, it's like I had to really get in touch with being a masochist. That sounds so terrible, but truly, I did. I had to absolutely have that experience. But what ended up happening for me is so, because I've reflected and I'm like, man, I could have made a different choice, but then I'm actually glad that I did. Like, I have my kid. I grew so much. I learned how to be by myself. I stayed single for 6 years, and that's not something, once you learn that, I want to make that clear to anyone. This is kind of
Mm.
going off on a pig trail here, but like, once you learn that, that's not something that can ever be taken away. Like, I've had, whenever I knew I needed to end something because it was just time, I wasn't afraid anymore, because I had done that. And like, so I learned these like deep lessons of how to surrender and how to like face something that once was there is not there. Very Piscean kind of stuff going on. But when I had my nodal opposition, so I got pregnant at 19 with my oldest kid, and I had my second kid during my nodal opposition. And this was the time that I started, so I got another opportunity. The whole thing I was thinking that this point of time is stuff about family, like nuclear family that I came from, really needing to just confront the truth and just be myself. But then also this underlying question the whole time I was pregnant, which is fascinating because my son's Pluto is in the fifth house. Okay. And I'm like, oh man, this kind of makes sense here. Definitely a different person, but uh the whole time I was like, what is my purpose? There's something I know that I'm meant to do. Very Virgo Pisces. Like, I can't continue to have these careers that people want me to have and, me experience just absolute disillusionment every single time. Like, there's got to be something out there. And I was really deeply getting into like a more spiritual practice and not doing it here and there, like only when I was in a crisis. It was like, no, I need to commit and to devote to this because there's something I just could feel it. And so that nodal opposition I got really like brought out this opportunity for me to revisit something that I kind of started doing during my first nodal return, but I had to go back and kind of repeat stuff to where then it was like, you know, just absolute self-determination to figure it out from there.
So you're talking about the nodal opposition, so
Opposition.
everyone can see.
Mm-hmm.
This is really the next pivotal life cycle that happens at 27 and a half or so. So this would be the next grouping of
Yep.
significant transits, basically 27 to 30. And as you mentioned earlier, like this is kind of so you're just speaking about this during the nodal opposition. So many people at 27 have again nodes have profoundly life-changing experiences, and they think it's the Saturn return.
No.
It's not. It's we're approaching the Saturn return, right? So like
Yep.
you're just a year from the beginning, right? But it's like it's a part of that whole cycle. So your secondary progressed moon return. So that's sort of like a reinitiation of who am I? It's like this level of self-discovery and emotional reconnection that's really powerful. And it happens with the nodes opposite each other. And
Yep.
that's challenging, right?
It
The
is.
transiting south node on the north node is giving a lot of attention to, whatever is relevant to moving forward and growing. But then the transiting north node on the south node is giving a lot of attention as well to any kind of unresolved dynamics that need to be integrated.
Yep.
All of these nodal transits can be very challenging, and also very growth oriented, both the returns and the oppositions.
Yeah.
So, for me, this was when I was I was already giving readings and earning money, but I think this was a pivotal turning point where sort of a career in this work became more crystallized.
Mm-hmm.
Um, During that window, I wrote it's like I began teaching students for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote up my ebook, Evolutionary Astrology Beginner's Guide. I was invited to write the foreword to Jeff Green's Pluto book somewhere around age 27 or 28. And at the Saturn return, I began teaching my first classes and like my first mini course around that time as well. More often than not, um, people go through pivotal life changes and become very introspective, deeply, reflective of where am I going. But it's we're not always gonna find. I have observed this many times. Big, massive changes, like things might look the same. You might already have a family, you might already have a job. Like the structural realities of our life, unlike the earlier transits, may not change very much. It
Yes.
might simply be, okay, you've been doing your work, and here are some doors are opening for you, and here's some content to work on, and keep on going. And we'll look later on in life to see how that kind of develops and strengthens. It's a very common experience during those years where just things get more clarified and refined, but and defined, right? But not necessarily real big circumstantial changes. If, however, we have been repressing our soul program and we're not in touch with really our deeper purpose, that time period can be, I would say, depressing. Right? We have like the whole like 27 club, all these celebrities that have died at age 27,
Mm-hmm.
often to drug overdose. Um, it can be really hard to face ourselves when all of this deeper content's coming up, and you have the pressure of that Saturn return, which is like, who do you want to be? We might need to make a very big course change, maybe quit the job that we've thought we've needed to do, and
Mm-hmm.
start to actually take a new course or go back to school or start a new program in a different direction. Or if we've been slacking off, Saturn return will say, great, now how are you going to support this family that you're about to get? So
Yeah,
there can be a lot of pressure to make change. It can be very daunting and depressing.
absolutely. I think something else that's worth mentioning with this is why I love astrology is because it's like, I don't want to use the word perfect because I don't like that word, but there's a natural order to things, is what I want to say. So with that progressed moon returning on the heels of the nodal opposition, to me, what I've seen with this is an opportunity for someone to start a new cycle around how they are going to emotionally nurture themselves. And then with that nodal opposition, it's going to bring up things to kind of give you a, a test a little bit. And with Saturn there, it's like, well, this is how we're going to emotionally mature here now.
Yeah,
This
exactly.
is how we can set this in to kind of grow more, to, yeah, to gain more wisdom. But it's, I think that those last three kind of layers that are happening at the end of the 20s is interesting. And I definitely had the dynamic that you spoke of whereas, and I'm glad we're talking about this, you can either, if you have been really following your evolutionary path and you haven't been resisting it, but you've really been working towards whatever you've set out to do, essentially. By that first Saturn return, a lot of fruition can come about. And
Yeah.
it's like it's what you said, it's doors are opening, or all of a sudden it's like, oh, because there's been this Saturnian um what is the word I'm looking? Self-determination on some level. Now, that is more of what you experienced. For me, there was a lot of hiding, a lot of repression, a lot of perfectionism, and just kind of some of the not so pleasant stuff that I chose, that I needed to re-experience in order to get where I'm at. But my Saturn return for me, following that um, progressed moon returning, and then my nodal opposition, and then the Saturn return, was I found a purpose I started to kind of understand this. I started to release stuff. I started to emotionally nurture myself differently. But then I had to kind of do more of this Saturnian work of being my own authority. Like this, that was the true test of self-determination for me because I had been suppressing. So it was like this was make or break time. Are you going to be your own authority or are you going to just slide back? Like that cardinal energy of, okay, I'm going to rip the band-aid off and then, oh, it just feels a lot more familiar back here, when
Right.
you start marking time. For me, it was a true period of time to the good old Oklahoma expression, pulling myself up by my bootstraps, like just
Mm.
having to just be like true grit and self-determination of really learning how to trust myself. And that was part of my emotional maturation process. So it can look, it's either you've resisted and suppressed, or you have been doing that Saturnian self-determination, work. And so it's,
It's really worth saying. I think as we get older, these phases need to be understood with more nuance and becomes more and more less of a one size fits all. I think
mm-hmm,
before the nodal return, there is somewhat more of a universality because there's so much fundamental, primal, ego, structural, physiological, hormonal changes that happen for everyone. But now it becomes a lot more individuated the
yep,
older you get. So I only have a good 11 minutes left. So let's address
yeah.
the next phase more quickly. And I know there's a few that I would be absolutely remiss if we didn't touch base on them.
Go for it.
So we're at the marker where we're like, okay, we've gone through all of the main cycles. Saturn's been activated. So this is a totally new phase. Like if this is like a television show, it's like the first series is done, or maybe the first series was like Nodal return, and then Saturn return ends, and you're done with like the second season, right? Second season's over. Um, I wouldn't consider this one of the bigger ones, but it's like significant, okay? Like ages 35 to 37, we have another Jupiter return, the next Saturn square, and another nodal return. Okay.
Mhm.
So nodal return, Jupiter return, just both of them again, expansive, more direction, karmic dynamics kind of being brought forward. And there's a lot of growth and expansion, even like clarity and energy moving that happens during that time. And that Saturn square is a push for more definition. Okay, here's
Mhm.
what you're working towards. How do you mature now? So that's a very strong period. What I consider, and Neptune also is somewhat elliptic, eccentric, so I'm not going to address Neptune, but it's worth everyone listening. Check out when your Neptune squares, because you could have your Neptune square sort of closer to your nodal return, or you could have your Neptune square closer to your Saturn opposition, Uranus opposition. So I would consider the Saturn and the Uranus opposition, which is like traditionally what we call midlife crisis,
Mhm.
as one of the top three transits of your lifetime. They are the most interesting to me because the last time we had a Saturn opposition, we were going through puberty. Yep.
16, yeah.
And this is the next big Uranus turn. Remember that Uranus is our individuated destiny. It's who we are when we're not suppressing what we are. It's a
Mhm.
natural unfolding of our unique soul vibration, our own soul individuality. So there's both a sort of, in virtue of being Uranus and in virtue of being in opposition, there's a lot of, I'm done with that. Seeing what's outdated, what's irrelevant or not true to my soul essence and letting it go. And thus, of course, opposition, a lot of pressure. We can feel really stuck, really kind of entrapped by our life experiences, a lot of stress. It pushes up against this need to further individuate and claim our own soul essence in this lifetime. And of course, we know all of the stories. That can go in so many ways. And
Yeah.
that Saturn opposition, again, is I need to define who I am without repressing myself. There's just so much self reflection, self awareness, and radicalization, both the level of introspection and often fundamental, core, essential change and structural change. Again, in terms of like these phases where like big structural changes will happen, I would say that is the time period where it's more likely that a lot of core fundamental structural change will happen to the likes of that we haven't seen since age 18 or 19.
Mhm.
And again, it's not a one size fits all, but it's so now of course there's that dynamic where for many souls it isn't necessarily about changing the forms of our life. Often that happens. Often it's like here are ways that I've been living that are not necessary. I need to be willing to embrace new structures. But sometimes it's just an internal process. So
Yes.
on the outside, things will remain stable, but we're going through an inner liberation. And it really
Mm.
just depends on whether there are structural realities that have become overly conditioned that need to be released. And that's for each individual. Um, do you want to speak to these before I move on to the next? Because they're so essential.
I mean, I feel like, I mean, honestly, I'm kind of looking forward to it. Because it's um I think whenever you're someone who's learning or has started to learn, you kind of touched on this, by the way, not in these exact words, but when you are learning to consciously work with energies, unless something's fated, it's out of your control. This can be, to me, what I've seen. I have a lot of clients that are like in these, most of my clients are like Pluto Virgo, Pluto Leo, some Pluto Libras. Um, it's got to be on my Capricorn or something. I don't know. But
Mm,
what I see with this is that it's either these people have been working consciously, and it's that self-determination, but then there becomes an awareness or there becomes an idea to thinking of the Saturn and the Uranus dynamic of, all of a sudden it's career has been going this way. I still want to do this, but
right.
now I have this idea that I can build upon off of this foundation, but I first have to let something else go first. And so there can be this stress around that. That's something that I've typically seen a lot. And it kind of just depends on where the person's at on their journey. But then I've seen this to where it's like if this is someone who's been more rooted in kind of consensus reality, this is when they're starting to have like the freak out moment of, I mean, I've
Big
heard like
time.
men say like, I'm an old geezer or whatever, like this is the time that I hear that. And so they're having to
Mhm.
question, their thinking around this or, time, space, reality, all of that. And then it's really, what do I have to do to be healthier? What do I have to do to continue to exist? I feel like that Uranus opposition can bring up a lot of fear for some people. You
Absolutely.
know what I'm saying?
And what's so fascinating is Saturn opposition can really be accelerating and bringing forward just the timing, the cellular timing of our human biology, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we really might begin aging and become really self-aware of, oh, I'm
Yeah.
aging, right? Even as Saturn is in a gibbous phase, right? As our transiting Saturn is in a gibbous phase, moving towards an opposition to our natal Saturn, I think that's when a lot of that stress can actually begin to emerge of, oh, there's a lot I need to do. I need to take care of my health. I need to tend to all these worldly responsibilities. So there's both a sense of embracing limitations and becoming more masterfully self-defined, but then also a possible deeper spiritual initiation into our non-physical essence. So
I love
it's just
that.
profound. And it's really cool for everyone listening to check out, depending on your generation, sometimes these will happen in the same year, or they'll be a couple years apart. It's just really cool to track that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so of course we have, Chiron return at 50 is a really big initiation, and that, just to speak briefly to that, that can be sort of tasting the tender truth of our medicine path. For
Yes.
those that are already familiar with that, it's you can't get beyond the tenderness and the vulnerability of meeting your Chiron medicine walk. Um, and for those that aren't connected to it, there can be pain, right? There can be
Yeah.
hurt, but it's all about initiating ourselves into how we are bringing forward medicine via our unique condition that, if embraced, makes us available to share healing and something that's truly of value to the world. But we need to embrace our own unique soul experience and be willing to step into our unique healing path and offer ourselves. So there's a lot of sweetness and tenderness that I often find emerging there. And like
I,
the next big,
I do
again, I
too.
would
Yeah.
bring that within like the top 3 or 4 life transits is that second Saturn return.
Mm-hmm.
So what's interesting about the second Saturn return, and I'm very curious to hear your observations, one of two experiences. For many, it's sort of a semi-retirement, meaning like they've done a lot of their work and they're able to let go and now enter into a new phase, almost like now they're the elder and they can begin to let go of certain structures, but embrace like a whole new dimension of being where they're not needing to define their career or their purpose. It's more a matter of, okay, what's the next step in my own spiritual evolution? What can I be giving my attention towards?
Mhm.
And that can look many ways, but it's sort of like, in many cases, this can be your career, your work takes on a whole new level, and
That's what I
your
was gonna say.
professionalism and your, but you're not like trying to achieve it. You've achieved it. And now
No,
it
I
gets to
see
take
like
on a new level where
people
you're
do
teaching.
passion
Yeah,
projects at this time. They become like passion projects. Do you know what I'm saying? The things that they
that,
wanted to do, but that has a higher meaning. Now they're getting to do it because
right,
the stress of having to survive and having to do the Capricorn thing isn't so intense anymore.
right. That's one dimension of it. But I guess what I'm trying to articulate is like we may not need to work very hard to get that success. We may have reached it, but then it's like our career and our work can move to another level. And
Yes.
so I see a lot of people and their career path and their teaching really take on a whole new dimension. And maybe it's instructing the next generation, or taking it to now you're mentoring others, or you're, the works that we've done can graduate Saturn to the
Hmm.
next level. And it's basically planting the seeds to really bring to completion the evolutionary purpose for this lifetime. And that's one dimension. But what you said too, there's this other piece where it becomes, I've been working so hard, and for the past 30 years I've been trying to support my family and working, right? But what do I really want to do?
Hmm.
So I want to study astrology. And then for a lot of souls, it might be, I actually want to become an astrologer. So interestingly, a lot of souls, almost like, it can be one, it's like you get old, you become the elder, and you're like in that elder role. But at the same time, we can have the other experience, or even simultaneous experience of, I've been the elder, I've been the mature, responsible one. Now I want to start over and be young and learn. So I'm going
Hmm.
to take this class. I'm going to explore this project or this passion or this painting or this art. And that actually might open the doors for an entirely new, and usually we'll have already started these things before the Saturn return. And the
Yes.
Saturn return will be some sort, again, like the first Saturn return, it can very easily be, here's a direction that you are now to continue to develop for the
Hmm.
remainder of your life. And I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Saturn is so like, it reminds me of building blocks, right? That's like the whole thing throughout our whole journey with Saturn throughout our life. It just is something that keeps, it reminds me of Legos, right? Like, what are you wanting to build at the end of all of this? And like these junctures, especially with Saturn returns, I feel like are adding room to that. Or does that make sense? Kind of as an analogy, it's like, it's just, yeah. And the other, I mean, I've seen the same thing as you have where people become the elder. I have a woman that I'm friends with. She, it's kind of this duality. It became a passion thing, or it was always a passion, but she now had the time to. She was an attorney and she did a lot of social justice work. And just the grueling nature of what she did, like to me, a lot of her work was selfless, but what she really wanted to do was to teach younger people about this, like the things that she had learned throughout her whole entire journey. So what she did around this point in time was she became a professor. Like she quit doing law, kept her law license, but she started teaching about it and teaching it. It's kind of has like a Uranian twist to it, I feel like. But it was in a very individualistic way. Like she had learned how to Saturn work within the confines of, society. And then she was able to then get this job that was really what she wanted to do. But now she was able to teach it in the way because people like they looked at her as an authority in it. All of these Capricorn words. She had, checked the boxes, done the things that she needed to do in order to fit within that structure to become an authority in it. And this was like the payoff for her at this point in her life
Mhm.
is, you know what I'm saying? Like she
Yeah.
got to do it in the way that she wanted to do it, that she felt had a lot of benefit.
Well, it's worth saying that there doesn't have to be big changes or
Mm-mm.
anything. Again, it can be you're still playing the same job, doing the same thing, but remember that Saturn corresponds to these gates in our life journey where basically we're learning lessons. and it could say you've done your work, and so there can be a greater ease. Like fundamentally, even if there's not a lot happening on the outside,
Yeah,
there's a sense of, okay, for those that have been following their soul curriculum, when we graduate with Saturn, it says you don't have to learn those lessons anymore. So there can be a settling into greater ease, which means on it we're more stabilized. Our root, our ground
absolutely.
is more stable, and so we get to focus more on the subtler dimensions of our own journey.
Yeah.
So let's go to the last transit, which I'm actually really excited about. Again, Neptune's a little bit elliptical, but it's going to coincide more or less with the Uranus return. So Neptune opposition, Uranus return, first four-ish years of 80. Obviously, that's probably going to be the minority of my clientele, and most, although I've seen it and it's radical. I mean, there's less of a case study for me in this regard, but this honestly is one of the most radical, liberating, spiritually profound periods of our life. Uranus return, of course, being what Uranus is, a Neptune opposition, really bringing to like what is the ultimate meaning and purpose of our life. There can be a resurgence of spiritual energy. And
Hmm.
we were just talking prior to meeting, and I want to give this example because I'm like, oh, wait a minute,
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders, how old is he? So right now he's traveling the country, giving lectures the same size apparently or similar to when he was running for president, and he would amass these huge crowds, teaching, educating people about the growing oligarchic state here in this country, which I agree is what's happening.
Yes.
And so I'm like, what are his transits? He's in a Neptune opposition with his
Mhm.
natal Neptune in the 10th house, right? Ethics, doing good for the world, and a Uranus opposition, right? Transiting Uranus is actually going to oppose his Uranus this year and next. So he's a great example of a soul currently going through these two transits, and it's incredibly radicalized. It's like he has all the spiritual energy, and it's like, where does that fuel come from?
Yeah.
So good example for that.
No, it's a perfect example for it. I love it. Annie's about to have his nodal return or nodal opposition, excuse me.
Oh, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I love it. And he is, I think, well, we did talk about it. He's just like a grassroots, wanting things to be organic, wants to be a good steward. I feel like for him, whenever I'm looking at, he's got that mutable stuff going on in his chart. He's totally aligned with natural laws. His Uranus in that seventh house is very much like giving, sharing, and inclusion. And I'm going to be a voice, and I'm going to, if it's got to be radical, that's fine. This is what it takes. And
Yeah, exactly.
again, the higher
It'll be
purpose,
cool to
higher
see how it
meaning.
goes as Uranus actually moves into that opposition.
I know it'll be
Fascinating.
interesting. Well, all right. Okay. I know you've got to go, and I've had a lot of fun with you.
This is great.
Me and
This is
you,
really fun.
very saggy, ended up kind of just, I love it. So before we get off of here, what we do want to say to people is me and Ari are teaching an upcoming class series for the Jeffrey Wolf Green Evolutionary Astrology Association, and it is around Venus, sexuality, and evolution through the 12 signs. Ari is going to be teaching on Venus and Gemini and Sag. I'm going to be teaching the class on Taurus and Scorpio. And then we have Rav Shahal, Kristen Fontana, Jason Hawley.
I gotta go, so let's speed it up.
Yeah,
Basically, free class
yes,
on that happening this weekend. Both Jordan and I will be there, and you can register.
absolutely.
I imagine you'll put it in the
I
details.
will. I'll put a link in it. All right, bye,
Yes.
Ari. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.